Scott Doctorman. Chad Leistikow. Together on one pod, talking odds and all things Big Ten. Powered by GameDay Men's Health, with locations in Ankeny, West Des Moines, and North Liberty. From the Channel Seed Studios, this is Legends and Listeners. Exclusively on Iowa Everywhere.
Hey, Hawkeye fans, Big Ten fans, and Iowans everywhere. It is episode 49 of Legends and Listeners on the Iowa Everywhere Network. We've almost reached a full year in this endeavor, and as always, coming to you from the Channel Seed Studios. I am Chad Leistikow of the Des Moines Register, and I'm without my Legends and Listeners partner, Scott Doctorman, this week. Scott is on a much-deserved vacation. Hopefully you caught his excellent episode last week while I was away with the one and only Gary Dolphin. It was a great show. I had a great listen to that while I was away. And now it's my turn to bring a special guest onto the show. But before we do that, I want to give thanks to our presenting sponsor of Legends and Listeners, GameDay Men's Health. Fellas, it is time to get yourself right. Get back in the game with GameDay Men's Health. That includes testosterone replacement therapy. Low T is a very common thing in men as we get older, and GameDay Health can get you feeling like you're in your 20s again. Testosterone replacement is a great way to improve your mood, your overall well-being, increasing muscle mass and strength, sexual performance, energy. Maybe it was because I was on vacation. But maybe my mental sharpness really right now seems as good as it has been in a long time as well. And like I was on vacation for a couple of weeks, and my wife gave me my injection the other day while we were getting ready for a hike in the Washington Mountains. So it's all really low key, really effective, very simple, and it can help change your life for the better. Get started with a free private, no obligation consultation. Check them out at GameDayMen'sHealth.com. or call one of their locations in Ankeny, West Des Moines, or North Liberty. And I am thrilled to be joined today by the Big Ten Network's Dave Revsine. Dave is a 1991 Northwestern graduate. After 11 years at ESPN, he joined a little outfit called the Big Ten Network in 2007 and has been there ever since then. Dave, that was way back when the conference had a mere 11 teams, I believe. Yeah, right. And
Yes.
As we speak today, Dave, you are surely prepping for an 18-team Big Ten Conference Media Days to be held July 23rd through 25th in Indianapolis. Dave, I know I've let you know this privately on several occasions. I've always been a big fan of your work. I think the two biggest fans I know of yours are my parents, and they're excited that you're on the show as well. But truly, the Big Ten is lucky to have a pro like you as its lead studio voice. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Chad. Really nice of you to say that as well. And I always appreciate your parents. One of these days, I need to meet them to thank them in person for their obvious heavy watching of the Big Ten Network. But yeah, thrilled to be entering what will be our 18th season of covering Big Ten sports, which just seems crazy. And in some ways, as you said, a ton has changed. I mean, this is the year of the biggest change, no doubt, adding 4 teams. I mean, that exceeds the total in 1 year that we have added in the previous 17 years combined. But then in some ways, so much stays the same. I mean, I still have some of the same great colleagues that I had on day one. A lot of the people that you would know, that people who watch the network know. Obviously, Jerry and Howard would be the most obvious ones, but Rick Pizzo
Right.
and Mike Hall still there. There's some people on the basketball side, and then a ton of people behind the scenes who I know aren't names that would necessarily resonate with people, but who have been there from day one and helped build something that I'm really proud of, that I know all of us are really proud of, and excited to go into this new era, which has a ton of possibilities and a lot of excitement for us. It really changes in some ways the dynamic of our network.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's just one of the reasons I wanted to have you on before things get really crazy here in a couple weeks in Indianapolis. But first, let's take a little bit of a step back. I want our listeners, our legends and listeners, to get tonight. I know you chuckled at the title when I first.
Yes, when it popped up, I got a kick out of it for sure.
Yeah, I got to give credit to my vacationing cohort, Scott Doctorman, on that. That was his brainchild. Before we get into some Big Ten stuff, I wanted our listeners to know a little bit more about you. You grew up in the northern Chicago suburbs. My wife is from Chicago as well, so a little bit of commonality there. You are, of all things at Northwestern, a European history major.
Yeah. Who among us isn't, Chad? Come on.
And maybe most importantly, as a father of three, your youngest, most recently being a high school graduate. My oldest is just going into high school, so a little different there. But of those three things, Dave, in your background, what are you most passionate about discussing today?
Well, I mean, I'm most passionate about my family. I don't know whether it's the most interesting discussion. But yeah, I have three daughters. One just graduated college, and then we have identical twin girls who just finished their freshman year of college. So, I don't know whether that's a particularly interesting podcast conversation,
Well,
but I'm most passionate about them. Yeah, yeah.
I do think it's in our business. Like my son's like, he's an amazing writer, and I'm like, don't go into journalism. It's a tough business on families. And I think people see you in the studio and the polished nature and everything, but there's a lot that you have to juggle. I mean, 3 kids and college and all those things.
No one's going to take out the tiny violin for us, Chad, because I do think that, look, we get to do for a job most people do for pleasure, which is follow sports. It's really fun. You do miss out on a lot. I mean, working weekends, my kids know no different, because even when I was at ESPN, when they were born, I worked a lot of weekends, especially during the fall. I had the College Game Day radio show for 6 years before I left for a few years with Mel Kiper, and then with DiNardo and McShay. And so we'd be on the road. I did a lot of college basketball play-by-play during the hoop season. Those were usually weekend games. And then you worked a lot on weekends. So my kids don't know anything different. But it's tough. I mean, one of our daughters played on a field hockey team that made the state championship game in Illinois her junior year, so a couple of years ago, and I couldn't go. It was on a Saturday. So I'm like watching the stream in studio. That was tough. I mean, that's hard. But the trade-offs are worth it. And they know I'm omnipresent when I can go. I don't miss anything. So sometimes I think they wish I'd go a little less, but yeah, those are the trade-offs, and I think it's worked out pretty well. They're all seemingly happy and well-adjusted kids, and we have great relationships. But that part has been tough, and it's tough not to be able to, for 8 months of the year, not really be able to go away at all, and we miss all kinds of weddings and that type of thing. But it kind of, I hate to say it, but it kind of is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think the last time I saw you, we were at the Big Ten championship game, and we were watching the Oregon-Washington game with a cluster of us. And I remember,
that was fun. Yeah,
I remember I think your daughter was at the Northwestern Purdue.
She was
men's basketball game.
Yeah,
you were scurrying away from Oregon-Washington, the Pac-12, to go watch the Cats upset Zach Edey and company in Evanston. And I just remember that. I was like, that's pretty cool. He's texting his daughter during the game, and you kind of.
My oldest daughter went to Northwestern. The two younger ones do not.
Okay.
And she is a fanatical sports fan. I mean, sports of all kinds. If you did a deep Google search, you could find an article that I wrote in the New York Times about watching baseball with her.
Wow.
It has to be about 15 years ago now. It's quite a while ago. But she was a huge White Sox fan. The poor kid, she still kind of is. Talk about something that's passed down like a defective gene. Being a White Sox fan, it's a tough gig. But that's the curse that my family has. But she's a huge Bulls fan. I mean, she loves sports. And so, you're in college, you follow sports, and so she was in a mainstay in the student section during her 4 years in Evanston. And yes, I would say she would tell you that one of the highlights, or the two highlights maybe, of her college career, were rushing the floor twice in a calendar year for knocking off number 1 Purdue. They did it twice in less than a year. So, so big sports fans. And my other girls are sports fans as well. But the oldest one is probably the most passionate. And they're all great athletes. Somehow they overcame my genetic predisposition not to be a great athlete. My wife's a pretty good athlete. So, but yeah, it's been fun. Sports definitely a big part of our lives, and something that they share that passion, all of them.
That's awesome. I'm gonna have to check out that article. Definitely want to read that. So, as you mentioned, Dave, you've seen a lot in your 17 years at BTN. Expansion now 3 times. You've seen the cancellation and revival of a Big Ten college football season amid COVID. You've seen coaching icons almost being torn down from Joe Paterno to Pat Fitzgerald most recently. I mean, crazy stuff in this crazy conference. But I just wondered, is there one day or one story in your tenure at BTN that maybe stands out as kind of really resonating or most memorable that you've been a part of?
So all those things that you mentioned are really memorable, Chad, and some of them, a lot of them aren't necessarily great stories, unfortunately, and that's part of the business. I mean, I think one of the things, I'll tell you this, I'll get to the answer eventually, but one of the things I will say is when I met with Jim Delaney and Mark Silverman, it was technically, I guess, my second interview with the Big Ten Network. And it was obvious they were going to offer me the job. And I was debating whether or not I wanted to take it. And I think one of the things that made me uncomfortable a little bit was I cashing in my journalism card at the door? Was I essentially going to be some sort of a corporate shill? And I didn't really want to do that. I mean, I felt like, look, we're here to tell good stories about the schools in our conference. And I understood that ultimately was going to be the mission of the network. And that's what I want to do. But I asked Commissioner Delaney, what happens when something bad happens? Like, are we going to cover it? Or are we just going to pretend it's not happening? Or are we just going to give it some sort of a whitewash? And he said words that have stuck with me forever for that, whatever it's been, 18 years now. And that I've repeated to him and that I've repeated to some of my colleagues as well along the way, which is if there's something happening in the Big Ten and we're not covering it, then we're not doing our job. Mm-hmm. Some people are going elsewhere for Big Ten news. We fail. So that was enough for me. And I do think that we've covered those negative stories. We haven't always covered them perfectly. And I think we've learned along the way what the right way to do it is. I think the Paterno story was particularly challenging because it was such uncharted territory. But the most memorable stories to me are the good ones. And so I guess I just have to say the football national championships. I mean, those have been the seasons that we've covered that have ended the best. Ohio State in 2014 and Michigan this last year. It's just incredibly fun. It's incredibly fun to see fans and players and coaches celebrate in that way. The joy, the unrestrained joy, I just think you can't replace it. That's why we play. I mean, I don't want to seem trite, but you play to win and you play for championships. And there's lots of other stuff that comes with it along the way that I think is valuable. And I think you can have a great experience as a fan, even if your team never wins a national championship. And same with coaches and players. I don't think it's the be all end all, but when it happens, man, it's cool. And it's fun to be in the middle of it. And particularly, let's just be honest, kind of given some of the challenges the Big Ten has had on the biggest stage. I mean, I've covered so many losses in college basketball national championship games. Those are hard. And those have been teams that have been good enough to win national titles, and it just hasn't happened. And those locker room postmortems are brutal. And you really feel for the people that are involved in them because it's tough. I mean, you're 2 hours removed from, you're really 15 minutes removed from the end of it, but you're 2 hours removed from kind of all these hopes and expectations. And then it kind of gradually over the course of the evening fades away. And those are hard. So to me, the best moments are when teams win. And the two that I've been able to be there for are Ohio State and Michigan football.
That's a great answer there. I was kind of curious what you'd say. And I just want to kind of reiterate, from my viewpoint as a fellow media member, I've always appreciated your professionalism in those tough moments. And I think back to even last year, after the Fitzgerald fallout, I believe you were grilling the university president, correct? Right? It was like right before media days.
It was Derek Cragg. It was the athletic director.
Director. That's right. Yeah.
It was a tough spot.
And that was a tough interview. That was a tough. That had to be difficult, but it had to take a lot of preparation too. I mean, that's not easy to be asked to be in that hot seat and on camera. The whole world was wanting to know, hey, why did you just get rid of this, icon of Northwestern. Your alumni school too. You handled it really well. I'm curious how you did that.
Well, I think part of the thing that you always have to think about, and I'm sure you're in a similar spot when you cover difficult stories, Chad, is that you're the stand-in for all the people who want to know the answers. And so your job is to get those answers. And I think probably the two most difficult interviews I've had to do in our time at the Big Ten Network are the one that you're talking about there with Derek Gragg, who's someone that I know and like quite a bit. And then Kevin Warren, when the football season was canceled, and I had to do an interview with him, and I like him quite a bit. And so it's strange. I think when you're in these spots with people you know and like and admire, I hope that they know that what I'm doing is just my job. Like you have to ask the question.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't answer it, you have to ask the follow-up and kind of say, hey, you got to answer the question here. And because that's your job. And if you don't do it correctly, if you don't ask the questions that need to be asked, you lose credibility with the fans. And I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with Commissioner Delaney, which is ultimately the fans have to trust our network. And if I'm the person that's representing the network, they have to understand that we're going to be fair. I mean, I never want to feel like I'm asking unfair questions. And so, yeah, you do think a lot about what is the right question to ask, what is fair here. But you have to ask those questions. And again, if they don't get answered, you have to ask them again until there's some sort of an answer. Now, at some point, people are just going to evade perhaps and not answer. But that's just kind of the way that I see my job. And it's hard. I think one of the things that's really different about being at the Big Ten Network versus being at ESPN is that you are involved with the people that you cover. I mean, I know these people well in some cases. In both those cases. And so that part of it is hard. It's different if you're like, I reported for Outside the Lines when I was at ESPN, and I had some tough interviews there, had some times where it wasn't necessarily a friendly interview, or you weren't, it might not reflect well on the person you were asking questions of, but I didn't know those people. So it's a little bit different. I didn't know their family. I didn't know their wives. That's the hard part. You mentioned Pat Fitzgerald. We didn't actually talk to Fitz because, he wasn't talking to the media for obvious reasons. But I know him really, really well.
Sure.
I know most of the football coaches in our league really, really well. So, that's hard. It's hard to see people that you admire or respect in a tough spot. And we've seen it with a number of people in this league. But again, it's just the job. Like, you just have to do it. And I think people understand that you're doing your job.
Yeah, well put. I think Kirk Ferentz, from my experience, is one of the best ever dealt with that. Because a lot of coaches can be really thin-skinned, and he understands that you do have to ask tough questions. You do have to be critical. And all that he has ever asked of me and others is that you just don't make it personal. And so as long as you don't make it personal, as long as you're fair, I think he respects that. And I think that's how I see your role too. And I feel like that, you've done a really good job of being tough, but fair. I think that's a good, approach as hopefully young journalists are listening to this too. You don't want to make it personal, because then it just becomes, you don't want to be the story. The journalist doesn't want to be
for
the story.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I would say, again, we were talking about the most extreme examples there in our previous discussion, but we've had to ask tough questions of Kirk on a number of occasions, and not as many times as you have, right? We kind of parachute in a little bit more. Right. Well, I mean, we do, because we have so many schools, right? And you're there day in and day out. And so probably you've had more of an experience, but Kirk is a great example. And I mean, my admiration for him is off the charts. And I think the world of him. I really, really like him a great deal. and think he's a fabulous football coach too. But he is so good to us in terms of he answers the questions that we ask him. And I think part of what's cool, like the flip side of it, that it is more personal when you know the people. The flip side is they know you too. And so if you are someone who treats people with respect, is fair, comports yourself in a manner where they understand where you're coming from and they can respect where you're coming from, then I think on their end, there is more of an understanding as well, because there's a relationship there. Kirk Ferentz knows I like him. He knows I think highly of him. And so if I have to ask him a challenging question, he knows it comes from a place of all of those things we talked about, and we have a relationship. So I do think it cuts both ways. And I think in some ways it makes the job a lot harder, but I think in some ways if you do it the right way, which I hope I have, it makes it easier too.
Absolutely. 4 new teams, as we mentioned, Dave, in the Big Ten this year. Curious, from your end, what are you doing? What is Big Ten Network doing to make Washington, Oregon, USC, UCLA kind of, welcoming in to this viewing experience? Are we going to see like instant classics between Oregon and Washington? What's the BTN approach here to bringing them aboard, so to speak?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, I would say the big thing, Chad, is there's been a ton of groundwork that's gone into it. And this is where I talk about people who are behind the scenes at the network. I mean, things that you just don't think about, that the average viewer doesn't think about, would be facilities on campus. So, for instance, there have been numerous site visits at each school, making sure that all of the venues are wired to come back to BTN. So for instance, when we do a soccer game from Iowa City, as people might be aware, maybe they're not, because this is different from what it was like in the early days. We don't send a television truck there anymore. We used to, but that part of the business has changed really dramatically. And so all of this is done, like there's fiber that transmits all of these signals. It's essentially done over like really, really great internet. It would be the best way to say it. Like that's how the signal goes back. And that would be for almost all Olympic sports, I would say. And occasionally for some other sports as well. And you would never know the difference at home. Now you would have 12, 15 years ago. I mean, I do think technology's really improved, and we were very much on the cutting edge of doing that. So all of those venues at all of those schools have to be equipped to do what we need them to do to broadcast those games. There's tons of man and woman hours that go into making that happen. And again, that's been for UCLA and USC, it's been a 2-year process. It's been accelerated clearly for Washington and Oregon, been a little bit less than a year. So there have been lots of visits out there to kind of get all that stuff up and running. From my point of view, I've been to each one of the campuses. I've been to UCLA and USC twice. I've been to Washington and Oregon once. I've met with all the athletic administrators. I've met with coaches. I've done so on August 2nd, we're going to have a day where we welcome all 4 of those schools in. I have taped some programming at each place. I do this long form interview show, which you may have seen, Big Ten Trailblazers. I have a Trailblazer for each school. They're awesome. They're really good. We really lucked out. All 4 of them were just tremendous subjects. And I think people are going to really like those. We have 13 original programs that will air that day.
Wow.
3 for each school, and then one that's kind of a broad-based program that will incorporate all 4 of the schools, I'd say. So it's a lot. I mean, we're going to do a lot when you talk about like the classic games and stuff that will be up and running. I think as they join, I mean, there's a whole group that's been working on that. So, yeah, I mean, and then for me, the other big thing has just been as part of those visits. So I've taped the Trailblazer at each place, but then I've spent time meeting with people and yeah, I mean, like I had lunch with the tight ends coach on school, right? Like I'm trying to do everything that I can to make sure that I know those teams, because as
That's
I say,
great.
look, this is not brain surgery, Chad, right? This is not,
True.
but there is an expectation that if you turn on the Big Ten Network, that we know what the heck we're talking about.
Exactly.
And this is an accelerated course. And so last year I taped or DVR'd or whatever you do these days, I guess, put in my library games from each one of those schools during the course of the year and try to make time to watch them. I didn't get to every game of every school, far from it. I was telling Jed Fish I had done that. And he's like, well, you really wasted your time with Washington. I know. Lost 21 starters. So, but yeah, I mean, I just feel like there's an obligation to know what the heck you're talking about, or at least to do your best to try to know. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get up to speed so that when a UCLA fan turns on the Big Ten Network, they say, okay, yeah, these guys know our team.
That's great. That actually dovetails right into what was my next question. So maybe there's a little repetitiveness here, but Dave, you're prepping now for 18 coaches, I am assuming, if the format's the same, and maybe 54 players to come on your studio over 3 days in Indianapolis. A lot of those new teams, Lincoln Riley will be on there for the first time, just a lot of new stuff. So how much goes into your personal prep? Because like you said, viewers are tuning in 2 weeks from today to learn about these teams, and they expect you to already know all that stuff. So I've always been impressed with how prepared you are in those live moments. I guess just what goes into that for you?
Well, one thing I will say is we're actually dividing it up this year for the first time. So there will be someone else that I don't want to get into too much detail, but there will be someone else helping me out. I think it seems smart.
That's smart.
It seems like it might divide between coaches and players. So but you still have to know the teams. But yes, it is the media day prep is onerous. I guess would be the best word for it. I'm a preparation freak, Chad. That is kind of I just feel like
it shows. It does show.
Well, thank you. There's so much that goes unused time that I'll never get back, that if on my deathbed, I could say, can I get those 6 years back that I spent sitting at my dining room table prepping for things that never actually occurred? But that's just the job. I mean, I think I'm sure when you're writing a big, long story and you get all kinds of stuff on background, you don't use all of it necessarily. Like I think every job is like that. That there are very few jobs where everything that you do ends up being a part of the actual execution of the job. But preparation is a big part of what I do. So while I will not be interviewing all 54 players, I definitely have to be familiar with personnel and then obviously know the major storylines of all the schools. So it is going to be, I mean, the biggest challenge of media day has always been, I say this often, you have to hold your bladder for 4 hours. Like that is right. And when you're almost 55 years old, that's easier said than done. So that's always the biggest challenge, but it's fun. I guess the biggest thing about it, Chad, and I hope you feel this way too, is I love it. I still love it. And I don't ever see that changing. I'm covering a league that I grew up following. I always say, I mean, there are 7 million Big Ten grads. It's probably more now. I'll have to update my numbers. It might be, it might be approaching 9 million. I don't know, some huge schools,
right?
Living graduates of those schools. And I'm the one person who gets to sit out there and do some of these events. Like, man, you couldn't come up with a better job for me. I'm so passionate about this conference. I absolutely love it. And so, it does feel like work when you're preparing. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I love every minute of that, and I wouldn't be doing some of the things we're talking about, hanging out with your family or whatever it might be. But I love it. So, assuming that I make it through from a from a bathroom visit perspective, it's always a great day, and it's great to see everyone. It kind of feels like, and you could probably vouch for this, it feels like a camp reunion or something
Yeah.
when everyone gets back together, and it's just fun to see people and say hello and find out how they're doing and connect and all that.
Yeah, I always kind of cringe when we have to do these preseason media polls before Big Ten media days, because honestly, I go there as as a reporter to learn more about these
Right.
teams too, and that includes learning from your broadcasts as well. I mean, I try to watch all those interviews because you pick up stuff there that maybe they don't say. You don't get to every player on the stage or whatever.
Yeah.
So it is a very informative deal, but before we get there, in your preparations, it sure seems like to me that everyone is kind of crowning Ohio State as the team to beat this year. Is that kind of the way you see it as well in football?
I would say Ohio State and Oregon to me
Okay.
are the teams to beat. I do think that. Well, I mean, Urban Meyer has already told us that Ohio State is perhaps the most talented roster in the history of college football, right? Which
Saw that,
I'd
yeah.
be fascinated to know what Ryan thought when he saw that. That certainly
Thanks,
sets
Coach.
the expectations high, doesn't it? Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks for doing that. I think they're going to be really good. I mean, the defense is going to be fabulous. I mean, to add Caleb Downs, like that's just crazy to me. It already is a ridiculously talented defense. It's clear that Jim Knowles was the right guy. I think he improved on the areas where they struggled in his first year last season. I think they'll be fabulous there. I wonder a little bit about quarterback in Will Howard. I don't think that he was the best guy in the portal, at least on paper. I think he's very good. But let's just use the example of Oregon. I think Dylan Gabriel's probably better, right? So
Sure.
Certainly his track record is a little bit better. He's, maybe you'd make the argument he's had better players around him, and that's fair. Although K-State's had some good teams, so that to me is kind of that's part of it. Is the Gabriel versus Howard part. I do think Ohio State probably has fewer question marks on defense. Like Oregon's got some questions up front on D. But man, they are so high on their size and their speed. I was on the phone with Will Stein, their offensive coordinator, last week, and he is just raving about the talent that he has. I mean, they think they have. I said I went to lunch with the tight ends coach. He was Drew Maringer at Oregon, who was the offensive coordinator for a time at Rutgers, people might remember. And so I knew him a little bit. He thinks he has 4 NFL players in his tight end room.
Wow.
Legitimately. I mean, they are oozing with talent. They're as good as the Big Ten, the traditional Big Ten teams are on the line of scrimmage. You have a defensive coach. So it's not, they're not, I think there's this stereotype of kind of wide open offense, and then they're going to give up 45 points while they do it. That's not Oregon. They had a really good defense last year. I mean, this is Dan Lanning's expertise. So I think they'll be really good too. I mean, if you said pick one over the other, again, without seeing them practice or any of that, I feel like Ohio State maybe has a fewer questions to answer, and maybe a little bit more of absolute top end talent. Like that running back room is ridiculous. And I don't think that Oregon feels like they're quite as deep at running back, but again, it'd be a nice problem to have to be one of those teams. They're both going to be really good.
I want to pause and remind you there's no better time than summertime to reach for a glass or two of Steeple Ridge bourbon. Steeple Ridge delivers a high quality, delicious drinking, award-winning craft bourbon. If you don't find Steeple Ridge at your favorite retailer, ask for it by name. Steeple Ridge is distilled, aged, and bottled in Iowa by Lonely Oak Distillery. And now back to Dave Revsine. Yeah, good analysis there. I mean, the other big storyline in the Big Ten probably is post-Harbaugh, the post-Harbaugh era at Michigan after what an unbelievable run. Obviously, here in Iowa, we're seeing, Cade McNamara is still, a remnant, I guess, of that 2021 team. That was so good. And just curious what this team is going to look like going forward. I mean, you go from really honestly kind of controlling the national championship game to what now? What do you expect from Michigan post Harbaugh Michigan?
I think it's going to be really interesting. I mean, I just think there's so many facets to it. There's kind of the immediate term of what's it going to look like this year. They clearly have a question quarterback. I mean, I think their whole offense is just a question mark. It's just really hard to know. They lost so much offensively, and really essentially all of the marquee pieces. They're putting an offensive line back together. Again, you don't really know at quarterback. You have Donovan Edwards back, which I think helps quite a bit, but losing Blake Corum is certainly significant. You lose your top weapons at wide receiver. There's a lot of uncertainty there for Michigan. Defensively, I mean, again, I think they'll still be good. I think they'll be good offensively too, but you've got new coordinators. I just feel like everything there is so up in the air. And so that to me in the immediate term is kind of the story. Is like, are they good enough to be in playoff contention? And there's certainly some who believe they are. I mean, I think you look at the preseason rankings and it seems like they're kind of on the margin of where people would make that playoff cutoff. And then longer term, can you sustain it? Is Sharon Moore the right guy? I think he is. I certainly have a ton of respect for him. He was great during that time where Jim Harbaugh was sidelined last year. He certainly, they didn't miss a beat, that's for sure.
Right.
So, but there's so much that goes into running a program, and so can he sustain it? And I would say Washington's interesting in the same way, right? I mean, they again kind of built it up,
right,
and had they essentially lost everyone. They literally have one starter back. There's one guy who's like maybe you could count as a starter, so 1.5 starters back. So yeah, I mean it's from square one. I mean I was with Jed Fish 2 weeks ago, and he's like, I don't know what I have. I think we have some good talent, but you don't really know, and so guys are sweating next to one another, and you figure it out. So I think both those teams, for similar reasons, are really interesting. That you made this great run, that you had historically good teams, and now can you sustain it with a new staff and a new template?
Do you think who's number 3? I mean, Ohio State, Oregon, you itemize as
maybe
as
Penn
the clear
State
favorites.
Maybe Iowa.
Okay.
I think those are the ones that are in the discussion. Like I think if you said the most legitimate playoff contenders in the Big Ten are fill in the blank, like to me it's Ohio State and Oregon's tier 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, I'd say Penn State, Iowa, Michigan. Those feel like the next tier to me. And then after that, I think if someone made it, it'd be pretty surprising.
Yeah, you got USC obviously coming aboard. People are starting to get excited about Nebraska, I think. But so I kind of wanted to ask you about some of these quote unquote Big Ten West teams. They're not Big Ten West teams anymore. But,
yes. The demise
we'll start
of
with
the Big Ten West.
Yeah, I know. It's going to be interesting. I mean, you go into
you.
these. Yeah, it's hard. You hear like, oh, I was picked 6th in the Big Ten. You're like, oh, that's such disrespect. You hear that but I'm like, dude, there's like 18 teams now.
Yeah,
like,
top 3rd.
Isn't that bad? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's basically like winning the Big Ten West.
Yeah.
But from these former Big Ten West programs, there's also the one constant, Iowa, and now you've got change. Let's start in Wisconsin. You've gotten to experience a little bit of the Luke Fickell era. When Iowa went up there last year, it didn't work. Iowa beat them 15-6 with no offense. So what is your impression, I guess? Will the Luke Fickell era, like the air raid system, can that actually work in Madison?
I think the jury's out. I think it's a fair question. I do think if you look at Luke Fickell and his track record, I have no reason to believe that he won't be successful there. Especially you look at year 1 to 2 at Cincinnati, he improved by 7 wins. So his first year there wasn't great either. I do think it's fair to question the air raid and can it work in the Midwest? Can it work in our weather and in some of the extremes that you have to deal with? But again, Phil Longo has such a good track record. It's just hard. I mean, when you played a certain way for as long as they have, and then you try to change it in 1 year, maybe it's just not realistic to think that they're going to be overly successful. I mean, they still ended up in a bowl game with a winning record. I know they were the team that was picked to win the West, and they didn't win it, and they certainly were disappointing. And I think they'd be the first to tell you that. I know he's spoken a lot about needing to have better leadership and needing to kind of have everyone dialed in and on the same page. So, but I do think it's just hard to do overnight. And they changed their defensive scheme too. Although I know they said that they borrowed some of the stuff, or that, Mike Tressel had made a visit to Wisconsin when they were at Cincinnati. And so I think there was some of the stuff that he had actually adopted that was part of their defense, but still, like, it felt a little bit like square peg, round hole on both sides of the ball. So now you have a year to refine it. I do think they'll be better. They went heavy into the portal, so it's going to be interesting to see at some key positions whether or not they're able to plug some of those holes. But I'm not betting against Luke Fickell, and I just think infrastructure-wise, and they have a lot going for them, as you know, in much the same way that Iowa has a lot going for them. There's just a lot of support, and I think they're in a good spot that way. So, yeah, I think they'll be better this year. I'd be surprised if they were a 500 team like they were last year.
Sure. A lot of excitement, I guess, or buzz, or maybe revenge factor from Iowa fans this year about Minnesota after a very controversial finish last year. Hawkeyes go up to Minneapolis week 4, the Big Ten opener this year, an early one. Curious about, a lot of Iowa fans don't like PJ Fleck, but I'm curious from your perspective, what are your impressions of PJ Fleck as somebody who's gotten to know him? Maybe you can give us a little bit different perspective than what we see on the sidelines.
I like PJ a lot. I get why he would rub opposing fan bases the wrong way. Like, I totally understand that. And I think he understands that. He says we're not for everyone. Right. So when you say you're not for everyone, you're implying that there are people who are not necessarily going to like what you do. I just think the thing I respect so much about PJ is that he has a way that he believes in doing things, and he has proven that it works. And so he's essentially saying, look, this is how we're going to do it. And if you want to be a part of it, great. If you don't feel like this is a good fit for you, I get it. But the guys who have gone and have stayed have been successful. I spoke with Tanner Morgan, actually, in kind of a interesting situation a couple of weeks ago. And I mean, we'd do anything for him, would run through a wall for him. So I like his approach. I do think, like, one of the things that's really interesting to me about PJ Fleck is I think if you were to talk to people nationally who maybe didn't know anything about him before he got to Minnesota, right? And oh yeah, that's the guy, Western Michigan, all the mantras and all that.
Throw the boat, yeah.
Yeah, and you're probably guessing, well, he's probably some whacked out offense guy, right? Like wide open, visor on backwards, all that kind of stuff. And it couldn't be further from the truth, right? He believes in line of scrimmage football. He believes in playing really good defense. He believes in controlling the ball and running it. So it's an old school approach to football, but with some kind of newfangled jargon and maybe with an approach that he thinks resonates with young people. Last year was a down year, no question about it. So I'll be fascinated to see, is Max Brosmer the right guy?
That was an interesting move. They
couldn't throw the ball at all last year, and they have a really good, like, Daniel Jackson's really good. So they had an excellent receiver. Injuries killed them. Is Darius Taylor can stay healthy? I think their story would have been a little bit different last year because he's a big time back. He'll be great. And then they have to figure out the defensive side. They really took a step back last year, right? Uncharacteristically, because Joe Rossi had so much success, and so now he has left. He's gone to Michigan State, and maybe it was a good time for a reset. Even though, again, I respect the heck out of him, and he's proven what a great DC he can be. But Minnesota's defense was nothing to write home about last year. So I guess I look at them, and that to me is the question mark. Is kind of, can you address the things that weren't good last year? Can you figure out a way to throw the ball? Can you stay healthy? And can you play defense like we've come to expect from Minnesota? And if you can, I don't see any reason why they can't be in that. If we're going to talk about tiers, like, can they be in the upper third? Can they be challenging around where we're talking about with Iowa? I think they could be.
Yeah, fascinating week 4 game for the Hawks. I mentioned Nebraska a little bit. I want to save 5, 6, 7 minutes for Iowa. So let's make this the
Okay.
last question before that. But is Nebraska a potential sleeper team in the Big Ten? Or maybe who is your sleep? Do you have like a sleeper kind of identified based on your conversations with coaches that maybe we're not talking much about right now, but could be a factor as the season goes on?
I do think Nebraska is a potential sleeper, but I would also say, man, we've been saying that for years, right? So
Right.
at a certain point, I mean, when you are the Power 5 team that has gone the longest without making a bowl game, I mean,
Yeah,
like
that's
think about
unbelievable.
that, Chad.
Yeah.
Think about I'm older than you are, but think about our
Not by
childhood,
much. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And how good Nebraska was. I mean, a bowl game. I mean, that's not
Right.
an accomplishment for them. It's are they in the Orange Bowl, right? That was what
Mhm.
mattered. So that part of it is just mind-boggling to me. I do think, I mean, it's hard to win with a freshman quarterback, and so let's kind of
Yeah.
see. I know Dylan Raiola is supposed to be great, so let's kind of see how that fits together. They were really good on defense last year. I mean, that was an elite defense. So if they could figure out a way not to turn the ball over and to get better quarterback play, and if the defense continues on the trajectory it was on, and then you look at the schedule and it's backloaded. I mean, they have a chance, I think, to get off to a really good start and to get some momentum. So do I call them a sleeper? I don't know what you call them, but I feel like I'd be really surprised if they don't make a bowl game this year. And I think disappointed. It just kind of feels like they're at that point. As far as another sleeper in the league, actually one that I would say that I don't think people are talking about at all is Rutgers.
Yeah.
Rutgers has a great schedule, right? For the first time ever. They don't play
Yeah.
Michigan. They don't
Not
play
the Big
Ohio
Ten East
State
anymore. Yeah.
They don't play Penn State. They don't play Oregon. So if they can figure out a way to throw the ball, and Ethan Kaliakmanis comes in, and we were talking about, well, if Minnesota can figure out a way to throw the ball. Well, he was their quarterback last year. So
Right.
I don't necessarily know that Ethan Kaliakmanis is for sure the be all end all, the solution to all the problems at Rutgers, but he reunites with his offensive coordinator from Minnesota there. So that helps quite a bit. They have the returning rushing leader in the Big Ten in Cal Monangai, who I think is as tough to bring down as anyone in the league. And then again, they were really good defensively last year. I just think it got overshadowed because of their offensive problems. But still, I mean, they won 7 games. They won a bowl game. They beat Miami in a bowl. I know Miami was, obviously in a time of transition and, players weren't necessarily engaged. You can make every excuse you want to make, but they played the game and Rutgers won it.
Right.
So, and again, you look at their schedule, you look at how conducive it could be to getting off to a good start, and the fact that they don't play all these teams that have just given them no end of misery in their decade in the Big Ten. Again, are they going to be a team that challenges for the playoff? No, I don't think so. But are they going to be a team that could make some noise, that can knock off some people, that could have a much better record than people think? I think maybe they could.
You got a few minutes to talk about Hawkeye football, Dave.
I always have time to talk about Hawkeye football. Yeah.
Well, let's finish, about talking about the team I cover. Scott Doctor covers.
Right.
You've covered a lot of Iowa football in your time.
I have.
You covered a really disappointing 2014 Hawkeye season. They respond 2015, go 12-0. The Chris Doyle exit and racial bias saga in the summer of 2020. And the Hawkeyes ever since have been winning at a clip reminiscent of their glory years in the early 2000s. And they've somehow, Dave, won 28 games and 2 Big Ten West titles in the last 3 years with absolutely no offense. Somehow. So how do you feel Kirk Ferentz has survived all of these things when you've covered so many like legendary coaches, Paterno, Meyer, D'Antonio, Fitzgerald, that have kind of ended their tenures at their schools kind of unceremoniously or a little, on the decline. But Ferentz just seemed to survive. How have you seen him do that?
So is the question how he survived like the Chris Doyle stuff or how he survived?
I guess he just kind of keeps coming back from, 14, in Iowa it was like everybody was ready for him to be done. Like they were sick, high expectations unmet. They went 7-6. They had the Outland Trophy winner. Then they go 12-0 the next year. It's just he keeps coming back, is what I'm saying. And how has he been able to do that? He's been given a chance to do that.
I think he survived lulls in the program because he's a really good coach. I just think that ultimately he develops his players. I think one of the things that I've really come to respect is we have the advantage, as of getting to go to the camp tour every year and seeing teams practice. And they just emphasize, they're fundamentally really sound. They do so many things well. They usually don't beat themselves. They have elite defenses pretty much year in and year out, starting with Norm and now here to Phil, who to me is criminally underrated nationally. I'll never understand why more national commentators don't talk about him the way they talk about some of these other big time defensive coordinators. I think part of it is that he just lays low. He doesn't seem interested in being a head coach. I think he just kind of is happy to do what he does, which is churn out among the best defenses in the country every single year. So, having a solid defense keeps you in every game. So maybe that's part of how they bounce back. These last few years have been crazy because I do think people will, on one hand, look at it and say, wow, they made the Big Ten championship game 2 out of 3 years. And then on the other hand, you kind of look at this and say, man, what if they just had an average offense? And so I think that's the challenge for Tim Lester is, can you figure out a way to have an average offense? And if you can do that with the talent they have on defense, I think, I don't know how, I don't follow it quite in the way that you do. So I don't know how many national commentators are talking about Iowa in that playoff picture.
No,
I guess
not many.
I haven't. Yeah. I think they have to be at least peripherally in it. Don't they, Chad? I mean, you don't have to squint too hard to imagine a scenario where Cade McNamara comes back healthy, where Caleb Brown emerges as a really good wide receiver, where they built, where Lachey is back and healthy and gives them a great threaded tight end, where the two backs who over the last couple of years have each had their moments where those guys are good enough as a tandem to run for, 1,600 yards combined. I don't think that's unreasonable to think. And then where they play great defense, like to me, it just doesn't seem that crazy. I think health is a huge part of it this coming year. I mean, again, McNamara's got to come back and he's got to be healthy. Lachey has to be healthy. Like, again, you go down that list and you look at what happened last year, and I know it's bad. And I know that you can criticize, well, you need injuries are part of the game. You need to have people behind them and you have people ready to go. There can't be that steep a drop off, but they had really bad injury luck, as you well know, and as people listening well know.
Yeah, I'm real interested to see how it plays out, because I feel like those of us in Iowa, including the Iowa media, feel like this is going to be a really good team, but national, because everyone on defense is back except Cooper DeJean. And then, like you said, I mean, the offense has to be better. The coordinator does seem to be, bringing in that Shanahan style offense. Lachey's really good. You have the offensive line was more injured than anyone realizes last year. Yeah. It's going to be better. And then you got your quarterback. So, like you said, I mean, and the schedule really isn't that bad. Like, you add Washington, but we talked about them. They're rebuilding. UCLA is the other new team you add. Well, they're really rebuilding. I mean, their coach went to Ohio State to be the coordinator. So
right.
The schedule is not that tough. So I'm interested to see if what I think, which is I think Iowa is in that fringe playoff discussion. I mean, I think if they go 10-2, they got a shot.
Yes.
But they're not even ranked in most preseason top 25. So maybe we're off the mark. I guess, maybe we're giving too much credit to this Iowa defense. I mean, the Vegas over under on Iowa is 7.5, Dave. So I don't know. Wow. I'm interested to see where it kind of plays out, because maybe they've just been winning on this schedule. I don't know. Like, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know that number, but I feel, I don't know. I mean, I think they could be really good. I guess I just look at them like, they're going to be elite on defense. I mean, I was looking at Higgins tackle numbers from last year. a couple weeks ago, and I had a note on my notes that I keep for every school. It was 171, I believe.
Yeah, tied a school record. Yep.
I said that's got to be a typo, or that's got like I must have transcribed that wrong. And I went back into the I don't know, that was really the number. And then Jackson is crazy. I mean, they just again, you have so many answers, and I know you lose Cooper DeJean, but I think that secondary is going to be elite. Maybe this is the year that Wampa really becomes a star. You have Castro back there. I mean, you've got a lot of talent. I just think they'll be phenomenal defensively because they always are. And so you're always going to be in the game. I mean, we have seen historically awful offenses.
It is worse since 1984 Northwestern.
Yeah. Ooh, I watched that. That wasn't pretty. I would again, it's mind-boggling how bad they were on offense. You almost had to try to be that bad.
Yeah.
And yet they were in the Big Ten championship game. So again, I think it shows you, and maybe it shows you a little bit of the imbalance of the East and the West. And again, that's a separate conversation, maybe for a different day. But I do think that it also shows you that it's not that far. They don't have to go that far to be competitive. They just have to be like that 25 point a game thing that I know became kind of a running national joke last year. But like 25 points a game would, if you score 25 points every game, I realize averages don't work that way, but you're going to win a ton of games at Iowa, exactly. Right? I mean, so I'm high on them. I think they'll be good.
All right. So bus tour still continuing. Now you got West Coast, or is it a flight, or what are you doing?
There'll be some flights involved. Okay. Again, we're dividing some stuff up that we haven't divided up in the past. It just really, I mean, it was physically impossible just because of, we don't necessarily, the schools are incredibly cooperative, so don't take this the wrong way, but they don't want you there. You can't just say we're going this day, they do want to work on, hey, what days work for us? And so there are some major distances that need to be covered. So none of us will be at all 18, but someone will have people at all 18. And the ones that, I'm not going to, for instance, I'm working on, doing some back channel stuff to make sure that I see everything that I need to see and know what I need to know. And I know that the other analysts, and hosts are doing the same thing. So, we will be at every school. I think it's going to be, bigger and in some ways better than it's been in the past. And I can't wait. Like I love that time of the year, Chad. Part of it is I really love the guys I work with. Yeah. And so, for us to get back together and tell the same jokes that we tell every year and finish each other's sentences and catch up on one another's families and one another's lives. Like when I spend a crazy amount of time with them, like Jerry and Howard and I totaled up at one point that we have been on the bus tour together, like for, I think it was 7.5 or 8 months, something like that.
Of your lives.
That's amazing. Of our lives, right? Like
that's crazy.
It's an absurd amount of time. So we know each other really well is I guess a good way to put it. Yeah.
Well, an amazing year ahead for the Big Ten Network and the Big Ten Conference. No better person to talk about it, in my opinion, than Dave Revsine. Thanks, Dave, for joining us today on Legends and Listeners. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Chad.
All right, for Dave Revsine, this is Chad Leistikow. Scott Doctorman and I will be back with you together next week on Legends and Listeners, as always, from the Channel Seed Studios and only on the Iowa Everywhere Network.